All right, everyone, welcome to another interview in the Dice Placement series. In this series, we take a deep dive into a particular mechanism. In this case, it's dice placement, to kind of, really see how designers have implemented it in some of the more well-known dice placement designs or games that are out there. So today I'm super excited to have two of my favorite designers on the show, Shem Phillips and MacDonald, who are game designers with Garphill Games. How you guys doing today?
Doing well.
Yeah, doing great.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for being here. You guys have a good holiday break?
I had an okay holiday. I have an unwell cat, so our plans were sort of changed. We didn't go away. But it was nice having a holiday at home, and I don't think Shem ever has a holiday. So
I'm technically never on holiday and always on holiday. So
yeah,
I like it. That's why you work for yourself, right? So you can just kind of do whatever you want, whenever you want.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, cool. So I have you guys here today because you both have either designed or co-designed some dice placement games that are either have been released or are going to be released here really soon, and that you've announced that use dice placement as a mechanism. So we'll dig into that in a little bit. But before we get started, I just wanted to, and if people are curious about Garphill Games or about you two guys, there's a lot of interviews out there already. There's a lot of information about the company. I'll put some links to a few of those resources below this video so you guys can, if you don't know them already, get to know them a little bit better. So we're going to skip by all the biography and all the background stuff and just get to the good stuff. So if you guys want to go kind of one at a time, and maybe we'll start with Shem, if you want to tell us how you define dice placement as a mechanism, what that means to you.
So I would define it as like branch of worker placement, I guess. Worker placements where you have usually your own workers that you are placing onto spots, which will then block a spot for someone else. That's the very classic worker placement. Often they are round based, where you have maybe 2 to 6 or whatever workers taking turns placing to take actions, and then there's a refresh that will come back. And then you're often vying for first player so that you can get that tasty spot that next round. So dice puts a spin on that because dice can have values and colors and all sorts. So you can have more variety in what the actions do, how they power, that kind of stuff. And of course, there's now so many variations on this where there's no rounds, where the colors don't matter, where they do matter, and all that kind of fun stuff. So It's a big, broad category, I think.
Cool. And Sam, do you agree with that? Do you have anything to add to that definition?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think what makes a worker placement game, and as Shem said, dice placement is under the category of worker placement, is some form of action drafting. You're using pieces to draft actions, often that will block or it will scale based on how many pieces you've got there. What makes a dice placement game is that the pieces we're using are dice, and then kind of inherently these faces that come up on the dice need to do different things at these different locations. Maybe it's just, minor tweaks on those. So, a lower value gets less reward, or maybe it's massive changes. Different values actually do different things at different locations. And, defining mechanisms and categorizing is super hard to do because we have all of this beautiful innovation that's happening in the board game space. So the moment you make a definition, like a year later, someone's tweaked it enough that your definition doesn't quite work, and we don't have enough language to give to all of these mechanisms. But yeah, it's broadly using dice to take actions, to draft actions. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So then along the same lines, Sam, what do you like best about that? The using dice in a dice placement game? What kind of tickles your designer bone about that particular mechanism?
Yeah, well, I like worker placement quite a bit, but some of the more classic worker placements, I've just seen that style done so many times. It's done beautifully in viticulture and Stone Age and that sort of thing. But I don't think we need more games just like that, where you just put a worker on a spot and it blocks the spot. Just play those games. Play Lords of Waterdeep, that sort of thing. Well, with dice, now you've got the same tension of the blocking, but for the player, there's a lot more decisions. Now you've got all of these different faces that now mean something, right? A worker has one state. You could upgrade workers, change colors, but But inherently, workers have one state, whereas dice have 6 states. And so there's way more of a puzzle for the player. Oh, okay, I've got a 3 and a 5 and a 1. I know I want to take these 3 actions, but which values would I put to which? And it's just that extra layer, that extra depth for the player, more agency, actually, really, even though it sounds interesting that you're rolling dice, there's more luck, but there's also more agency with the dice. And the other thing that I love about dice is that this little 6-sided, this cube can cause so much elation and so much frustration. And I think it's the potential to frustrate which actually elevates a game, because even if it doesn't frustrate you, you have this feeling of relief. Okay, I didn't roll the value that was going to wreck my game completely. I actually got what I wanted. And then you have this beautiful, relief. Cool, I can do this sort of thing. And the potential to frustrate just creates all of this tension. And players, if they roll values they don't want, they have to kind of go out of their way to figure out, okay, what's my backup plan? And they have to adapt.
Love it. So it takes kind of the strategy of a worker placement and throws a little bit of unpredictability or a little bit of variability in there and makes it just that much more interesting.
Right.
Love it. How about you, Shem? Anything to add to what your favorite part of dice placement is?
Yeah, kind of touching on what Sam was talking about, the agency gets added. It's more like the decisions you make matter more, because it's not just what do you want to do. It's like, but if I choose this die, then that die can't do what it wants to do and that kind of stuff. I'm a big advocate for games having little touches of chaos in them, which is often referred to as randomness, but things that are slightly out of your control that you couldn't foresee, or not to the extreme that it just annoys you, but just those little touches, which is what dice kind of add for me. And yeah, I guess you can, where you swing that perfect information to chaos, where you find that balance in the middle is really important. So I like just a little sprinkling of unpredictability in games, because otherwise you're just playing Sudoku as a team or competitively, and it's a puzzle to solve. So you need some chaos thrown in.
Nice. And dice are ripe for that, because they can be rolled, or you can set them and change them, and so lots of possibilities there. Love it. So let's dig into your catalog of games. You're known for kind of certain trilogies of games: the West Kingdom, the North Sea, and then coming up now the South Tigris. But there's also other groups of games that you have, and the one I want to focus on at first is, I guess, one of the first dice placement games that was introduced in your lineup, and that's Circadians First Light. And that looks like that was designed primarily by Sam. You're listed as a primary designer there. So I'm curious, Sam, why you decided to focus on that as the primary mechanism for Circadians First Light.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm not sure the answer. This was when I was pretty early to game design. I think I started work on this when we were still finishing off my first game with Shem, which was Architects. And I didn't really know what I was doing. And I'm not even sure at that point if I had played a dice placement game. But I just knew that it was a thing. I knew that games had used dice as workers before. And that whole puzzle just sounded really, really interesting to me. I originally had this mechanism basically where you could send your dice out and block all of these spots where you would spend resources and get points and do that sort of thing. Or you could send your dices to your dices. What am I doing? Your dice to your own board and harvest resources. And I liked giving the players the decisions. Oh, am I going to get more and more resources, or am I going to go out and block these things with using the same workers? And dice just worked super well for that, because the values could depict how much you were going to harvest and what resources you could get. And so that was just the original idea, and didn't really look back from then. Dice just seemed to work for that game. And one day we stumbled upon, I'm not sure if you've played, but there's this harvester that you've got on a planet that you're moving around, and it's this hexagon shaped planet, six edges, and your die value depicts which direction you can move on the planet, which just works super, super well for dice placement. Yep. And once we had that and the harvesting resources at home, we knew that there was definitely a game here.
It all came together. So what would you say are some of the more unique kind of ways that you tried to implement dice placement to make it not just another dice placement game?
Yeah, I wanted every action on the board to require, obviously it's using dice, but that the pip matters, and each of them was also its own sort of mini game around the rules for placing dice there and what the dice do. So obviously that is more rules and it's less elegant, but I thought that was a fun little puzzle. So some of the mini games were, that you need to get to a certain value, and your die value plus a resource allow you to get to a value to do the thing. So that's at the mining camp. So you want a high value to save out on spending water. There was another spot where you have to use 2 dice of the same value. There's other spots where it just says a 1 and a 2 does this, a 3 and a 4 does this. I've already explained the harvest moving thing. But I think actually maybe the most innovative thing was the negotiations board. So in Circadians, you're negotiating with these local, we call them aliens. They're the locals, we're the aliens, but you're negotiating with them and you're putting your dice out to negotiate with them. You give them a bunch of resources and you get points. And you are permanently spending this die and you're not getting it back. So you're losing it from your dice pool to score these points, which is a cool tension because now you're going to have to get more dice to optimize your actions more. But the thing with that board is that the first person to put in a certain value for each die will get an advancement. So the first one that goes in there gets an advancement, which is this really cool little benefit. So this creates a race between the players to go in and send a unique value to the negotiate board. But over time, there's going to be more and more dice at the negotiate boards, and eventually it's going to trigger a setback. So the first person to make one of the locals have over 8 pips is going to get a setback, or the first pair of dice is going to be a setback. So there's this really interesting game for the players when to send their dice to the locals. Do they want to lose that dice straight away and have a really weakened engine, but they get this advancement, or do they want to wait till late game, have all of these dice, but then have to take the setbacks? So that's one of the unique things, I think.
And the value of the dice really add to kind of the strategy behind, okay, do I go to take this action and how does it compare to the other dice? And then you have, as a designer, so much room to, you can add the values together. You can have them all, you want them all to match. You can, have differences between the numbers, and that just opens up the design space, I think, so much when you're working with dice.
Yeah, that's totally right. And I wanted to make sure that you weren't doomed if you just rolled ones. Like putting ones in the negotiate board is actually better than putting high values, because there are advancements for a 1 and 2 and all that sort of thing, but also you're adding less value to the negotiate, which means you're less likely to trigger a setback. There are other spots where you want high values, but I think it's balanced pretty well where you're happy with low and with high.
So going over to Shem, so you typically act as the developer on these games. So when you're working on developing this game, what's going through your mind as far as tweaking it and making it work better that's unique to the dice placement aspect of it?
Yes, a lot of it for me is like for First Light was about the UI of the game. So like, how do we make this game intuitive? And not like all those decisions that it's going to be with the different action spaces and the dice you're using can be very overwhelming. So it's about making like everything very simple. So like using the pairs at the lab was like, oh, here's a simple icon that means pair, like things like that. That's what I was doing, and just can't remember, it's so long ago, Sam. But
yeah,
I think I was there for a lot of the testing, and just kind of building the world and stuff as well. That's a lot of what I do, is like creating it so it's very easy for players to get into. But as far as like the mechanical side for other games, I think for me it's more about the feel of the game. So like, are these dice becoming too frustrating for players, or are they just do they even need to be dice? That's the other swing of it. So why are the dice in the game? Do they act as dice? Do they have that randomness? But then the other thing is like, this is too much swing, too much luck and stuff. So I like to try and find that perfect balance where the players enjoy the game, but still have those little moments of like tension and agony where the dice doesn't do what they want it to do. So
yeah, and that's something I've found. I'm working on a dice placement game, and the sometimes the pushback I get because with dice placement, it's like worker placement, so it's highly strategic. You're planning out your actions, you're building a strategy around what you're going to do, but then you have the unpredictability of dice. Sometimes when strategy gamers see a game with a bunch of dice, they immediately discount it because they say, oh, I don't like dice. I don't like games with dice. I'm just curious if either of you have ran into that with these games, and if so, how do you address it? Or are there, do you try to convince them, or you just, let the game speak for itself? What are your thoughts on when you hear that from people?
Yeah, I think we've had good comments on our more recent games about like they were surprised by how much the dice didn't bring in luck, which is a good bit of feedback for us. It means that there's enough decision space out there where they can use that die for something at least. They don't feel like it's just an absolute waste. Because you can get that even in worker placement games where you have a worker and you're like, I guess this guy will just go here and get a stone. Like it's not exciting, but like that happens anyway without the dice. So
that's true.
Yeah, that would be our focus. So if we hear people saying that they got constantly frustrated or whatever, that's when we'd probably address the issue. But yeah, in our South games we're working on, we are making the mitigation of the luck quite easy. So, for example, in the second game, it's just one worker, which is a resource you can spend. You can spend a worker to basically set your die to any value. So that's like really easy mitigation. But, getting your worker economy up, that's the hard part. So you might run out of workers. So at least as a player how you can mitigate that luck in the game. So little things like that.
Nice. And I think that's important in games with dice, is definitely have lots of opportunities for mitigation, but also make it part of the strategy. So you can, build up mitigation resources as part of your strategy, or you can kind of, go with the luck and see where it takes you and maybe win big or maybe not. I like those kind of decisions as well in these types of games. So you mentioned the kind of the new series of games, the South Tigris trilogy that was recently announced. And it looks like, from what I can tell, the first two, which are Wayfarers and Scholars, both are going to involve dice placement. And is the third one going to involve dice placement as well?
Definitely so. Dice. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So so I'd love to hear, maybe Sam, when you're approaching this new series of games, and they're all using dice in some way, how do you make sure that each game is going to be different enough from the other ones when they're all kind of using the same type of mechanism?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think we really do just push ourselves to make sure that these games deserve to exist in their own right, that they do feel different from one another, that they still feel a part of the same world and they're sort of riffing off some of the same ideas, but that they are unique and deserve to stand alone. So our second game, Scholars, we had lots of different steps for designing this game. There were lots of origins, so to speak. There was the origin of the theme, and there was origin of some of the mechanisms. But one of the origins was just like 3 words: dice bag builder. And what could that do? You're building up. I know that I think Roll for the Galaxy sort of does that. But you've got this bag that you're putting dice into, and you're picking which color dice you want to add to your bag. And that idea just excited me. Now, that idea on its own has some really, really big inherent flaws, because if you're rolling dice, that's randomness that's added to a game, and bag building is randomness that's added to a game. So it's almost like bag building sort of simulates dice naturally without having dice in the game. And so to layer randomness upon randomness, we have to have a really good reason for doing that, or we need to give players a lot of manipulation, a lot of control over, okay, I drew these dice, but I can actually do things with them. So as Shem mentioned, we have the workers that can be spent to change a die to any value. That's workers of the color of that die, but you can also use the worker to change the die to any color. So if I've got a blue 1 and I have a blue worker and a red worker, I could use my blue worker to turn into a blue 6, or I could use my red worker to turn it into a red 1. And so players have a lot of agency there with the workers, how that works out. And building up this bag is so fun. Like getting to add something to your bag is so fun, and it's just so tactile. Putting your hand in a bag, drawing out 5 dice, and rolling them is just a really fun feeling. So we wanted to make that to work mechanically, because we knew that there was such a cool tactile moment that players could experience.
And that's something you typically miss in these more strategic dice placement games, is that visceral fun of just rolling a handful of dice and getting that excitement that comes from that. And so being able to incorporate that into, again, a more strategic game is a very cool concept. And then so that's Scholars, right, is going to end up being the bag builder. And then Wayfarers, how are you using dice placement in that way, in that game?
Yeah, so Wayfarers was this idea that players have this little player board, which essentially has 6 columns, 3 rows, 6 columns, and each of the columns at the top is a die value. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And what players can do is that they can purchase these upgrades that slot onto their player board, that say, might slot it into the 1 column, and it would say that 1s can now do this sort of thing. So the 1 has this type of equipment and now can go to these certain action spots that it couldn't normally do otherwise. Or when I use a 3, I get to gain a coin, or I get a coin discount on the action. So players are going to get a bunch of dice, they're going to roll them, and then over the course of the game, they're going to be upgrading this player board so that by the end of the game, everyone's completely asymmetrical. They've got this unique player board, which says, right, 6s are really great for me. They can go out and get space cards. They've got these telescopes on them. Or 1s are great for me. They've got boats and they can go and explore the seas. And players have a lot of control over that. So there is that dice rolling feel, but you're controlling your destiny. You have so much agency of what those dice are going to do. So we felt that was something that was quite intuitive and players can learn that really, really easily. But we also haven't seen that before. So we felt like this was a really cool step for board game design, to add to the dice placement conversation. To add to that, we also have workers, so that the dice are only used in your player area. And so you're buffing them for your own little tableau of actions that you're building up. But the workers are the shared resource, and it's a closed economy of workers. So workers aren't in my player color. They're just, anyone can grab them. And now if I go and put them out on cards, I can take actions that are on the cards. And then when someone grabs the card and adds it to their tableau, they now have the worker. So some players could have a whole bunch of workers and they could do worker actions. And other players could just be ignoring the workers and just working on their dice placement board and using the dice actions. And then there's all sorts in between as well. So when we had those two things, we're like, yep, this is a game as well. It's one of those moments like, yep, we know that this is going to be a game.
Yeah, that's cool. So it's not technically dice placement. It's more like dice selection, or selecting what powers you get from the dice, and then also worker placement in kind of the more traditional sense, and kind of how they can work together. That's very cool. So another question I had, and maybe Shem would be, this one is to you. When you're trying to decide kind of thematically what these dice are, first of all, do you care? Do you want to try to say like that you're rolling the dice and they have numbers because, and try to create a story around the theme of the game? And if so, like, how do you approach that? Is that something you think of, the theme first, and then you try to, and you're like, oh, dice fit perfectly with that? Or you're like, I have these dice that are doing this mechanism, and now I have to figure out a way to explain them in the theme?
I think dice are just abstract, and everyone kind of accepts that in board gaming. So
yeah,
often, we'll say that they're like workers or something. I think in First Light we pitch it as like, these are your workers, your crew, and you send them out to do stuff.
Right.
For the South, I haven't even bothered. These are abstract things in the game that you have access to, and you use them for actions. And Wayfarers, I guess, but the where you build your dice tab, your little kind of engine of what your dice do, we're calling that your caravan. So it's like your equipment and your people and everything that's working for you. The dice, I guess, are like your decisions to how you manage those things. And then, in Scholars, I think we kind of talked about it being like it's your knowledge. So you're drawing out this bag, and I'm thinking about physics in this particular round and a bit of biology, and then
Right.
using how much knowledge you have in the area on your turn. But I don't think we need to sell that theme of what these abstract cubes do. So I think Euro players are quite comfortable knowing that they're dice because they're dice. So
right.
it depends on the game. If it's a very accessible, lighter game, I think ramp up the theme because players want to know what they're doing with these dice, and maybe they like represent something quite, I guess, what's the word? Like tangible within the game. Like know what they are. But in these big, heavy medium weight, heavy Euro games, they don't care. There's enough else going on in the game to captivate them, I think. Yeah.
Just a way to add variability and unpredictability to certain little aspects of the game. That makes sense. So also for Shem, I guess if so, for those who are out there who are either working on a dice placement or some kind of dice strategy game, and they're working on it and they're thinking about maybe taking it to a publisher to pitch. So as a publisher, if someone were to come to you with a dice placement game and said, hey, I think this will fit perfectly within your library of games, what would you be looking for as a publisher that a dice placement game has in it to make it fun or strategic or something that you think would make a good game?
I think with any game with dice, not just placement, I'll be looking for a way they're using the dice in a unique way, or a way that maybe not unique, but at least brings something new to the table in a way that I'm like, that's inspired, that's cool. So if I don't see that, I think I'd be like, this could be any theme and anything, but if it's really inspired, then I'd at least be like, encourage them to keep with it. It's a good game.
Right.
Yeah,
and I think there's, like we've kind of already discussed, there's so many different opportunities to use dice in unique and interesting ways. You've touched on a few here, and I'm sure, like the whole bag building concept, take something that's already a concept in gaming, add dice to it and see what happens, and then try to figure it out and make it work. And I think there's still plenty of opportunities to do that in new and interesting ways. Cool. So as we wrap up this interview, I'd like to ask each of you what your favorite dice placement game, and we're talking strictly dice placement, so using dice as workers. If you were to, say, and it's probably like me, my favorite game changes, every week. But now, as of now, what is your favorite current dice placement game, other than, of course, the ones you have in your your company?
I was quite surprised when I was looking through, because I got my top 50 games that I rated recently. I was quite surprised to find no dice placement games in there.
Interesting. Okay.
I had I think it's called Dice Insertion or whatever, where it's like role player and stuff, and games with dice, but not actual dice placement. So I went through my collection, and I think the top one for me would be Marco Polo, the second one, just because it does what it should do. You can use dice together. You can use them in a singular way. The values matter, all that kind of stuff. It's got interesting interaction between players with the blocking, but you can often pay up to use the place someone's already been. And then there's a really good game underneath all that as well. So that'd be my kind of favorite of more recently, I think. Yeah.
Cool. How about you, Sam?
It's funny. It's an interesting question because categorizing is super hard. So mine is going to be slightly not dice placement, but it's super close. It's Lorenzo Il Magnifico, and players aren't actually using dice. Their workers aren't dice, but what happens is at the start of each round, you roll 3 dice, and they're certain colors, and everyone has workers of those 3 colors. And so their black worker might, the black die might be a 4, and everyone's black worker has a 4 value. So it really feels like a dice placement game, but it's in such a way that everyone has the same randomness that they have to deal with, which I think is super cool. And just a note on that, Shem and I, we think we're so clever designing a trilogy of dice games. We think that's so ingenious, but someone's already done it before. Virginio Gigli and his Italian friends, Flaminia and Simone Luciani, he's done Grand Austria Hotel, Coimbra, Coimbra is, I think, one of the most sensational dice games, one of the best uses of dice. It's not quite dice placement, but one of the best uses of dice. And Lorenzo, there's a trilogy of dice games right there.
Interesting.
So yeah, really, really amazing stuff there.
But are they a true trilogy where they're like connected by theme or world?
No, not a true trilogy. Yeah, so we might be the first to do a true trilogy of dice games. I don't know. Probably other people have done it. Yeah,
but that goes back to the point that in this point in the hobby, there's probably nothing entirely new under the sun, right? Someone has done some version of something before, and we're just kind of iterating, making it better, doing cool, new, interesting things with it. Awesome. And also kind of a follow-on question to that, is there any game that's upcoming that's maybe just was released or is going to be released that you think is using dice in new and interesting ways that you've never seen before?
So last week I was thrashing Under Falling Skies, which is Under Falling Skies.
Oh yeah.
Solo game, but it's dice placement, and the amount of decision space and tension in the game that's why it's a solo game. I think it's so brain burning in a way, because you have these 5 columns of dice of rows. 5 columns of rows, 5 columns, where there's going to be alien ships coming down. So, and you've got your base at the bottom. You roll your 5 dice at the start of the round, and depending on the value of your die, where you place it, that's how many spaces the ships come down towards your base. So you want low numbers. But then the room you place it in, which is kind of, I guess, the rows, is the action you're taking, and you want high numbers generally because you want big numbers to shoot down ships and do research and that kind of stuff.
Cool.
And you cannot place more than 1 die per column generally. So there's just really interesting puzzle. And on top of that, 2 of your dice are white, 3 are gray. And anytime you place a white die, you roll the rest of your dice that you haven't used yet. So when you commit a white die is important. Do you put your gray 6 in and your 4, 6 and then place a white to roll them? So that was really clever. And then there's a whole campaign of 4 chapters you can play through, which brings all this variety into the actual game you're playing. So very clever game. And I was actually surprised. I thought this is probably a hype game. I've heard a bit about it, but no, it's solid, really good.
Very cool. How about you, Sam?
My ear isn't completely to the ground, but I've heard of Cubitos, and I heard that that's basically Quedlinburg with dice. So that looks really fun. Looks like some silly fun, lots of laughs and stuff. So I am keen to try that out.
Yeah, that's a good one. And the fact that it's also a racing game kind of adds a different, fun to it as well, and unpredictability. And there goes my dog, of course, on cue. Whenever I'm doing an interview, he decides something is worth barking at. He's quiet all day, and then all of a sudden he decides to bark. So I guess he's telling us that it's time to go. So my last question for you guys is, who do you think I should interview next in this series? Is there someone you think has some, a designer that could speak to dice placement, someone that in the industry that would be a good next interview for me?
I think Sam has suggested maybe someone Italian.
Yeah, any of the Italians. Okay, so I'm just going to rattle off some games. Teotihuacan, Marco Polo, Lorenzo, Coimbra, Grand Austria Hotel. I mean, there's just so much dice pedigree amongst those 4 or 5. Trismegistus, 4 or 5 Italian designers who often work with each other.
Nice.
So, I don't know what their English is like. I have no idea, but they're amazing designers and they know how to use dice in their games.
All right. Well, I might have to learn how to speak Italian then. Comes down to it.
Worth it.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much. If you guys just want to quickly plug the games that you have coming up and let folks know where to find out more about them, please do.
So just keep an eye out for Wayfarers on Kickstarter this year, probably around March, April. That'll be it's our most dice placement-ish of all the 3 games in that series. So keep an eye out for that. Cool. And you can find everything else just on garphill.com.
All right, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes. Thanks again, guys. Super interesting chatting with you today, and I look forward to seeing these new games coming out in the future.
Cool. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks.
Thank you.